B'siyata d'shmaya, we're going to learn sukkah Daf Yud Aleph. We're going to start from the next Mishnah in the middle of Daf Yud Aleph, Amud Aleph. Says the Mishnah, and we already saw this Mishnah mentioned on Daf Tes Amud Beis, Hidla oleo es hagefen, if somebody lifted onto his sukkah as schach, the branches of a vine while still connected to the ground, ves hadlas, or the squash, bush or tree, ves hakisum, or ivy, v'sikech al gaba, and he put schach on top of this posel schach, psula, it is posel. And this is the halacha we've already learned in the Mishnah on Daf Tes Amud Beis, that putting a sukkah tachas or ilon under a tree is posel, and this is the psul called mechuber lekarka. Schach, which is still attached to the ground, is posel. And there's a discussion in the Mefarshim why it's mentioned also here when it was already mentioned on Daf Tes Amud Beis. What's the difference between sukkah tachas ha'ilon and hidlo aleo es hagefen is something discussed in the Mefarshim. Now the exact source why schach, which is mechuber lekarka, that's fixed to the ground still, is posel, is not so clear in the Gemara. We're going to learn today till the next Mishnah. We're not going to see in the Gemara an explicit source. Rashi here points to Daf Yud Beis Amud Aleph, where the Gemara is soon going to discuss different halachas. The halachas of Makabel Tumah and Giduloi min ha'aretz, we'll soon see what those are. And Rashi here says that the same posuk that acts as a source, at least in the Maskana, the end of the Gemara, or almost the end of the Gemara, what's going to act as a source there will also act as a source here, but it's not explicit in the Gemara. The Ritva has a different idea. The Ritva wants to say that we learn chibur lekarka is posel because of tasev eloi min ha'osui, a concept which we're going to learn about soon. Either way, this halacha we just saw in the Mishnah is not so clear what the source is. Moving to the next halacha mentioned in the Mishnah, vim hoya sikeich harbe mehem, if there was a lot more schach kosher than this schach posel, which is the schach that's mechuber lekarka, oy shekitzitzon, or if after you put the schach that was initially attached to the ground, you then cut and sever ties between the branches and the ground, in that case kshera. Now it's not mechuber lekarka anymore, or in the case of sikech harbe mehem, it's become, so to speak, nullified in the kosher schach, and then the sukkah is kosher. So that's all to do with mechuber lekarka. Now ze'aklal, there's another rule regarding the hechshar of the schach, kol shehu makabel tumah. Anything that's susceptible to becoming tumah, that's food items, clothes items, utensils, etc. Ve'ein gidulei min ha'aretz, and it's not, or anything, even if it's not susceptible to becoming tumah, but it doesn't grow from the ground, that means it didn't originate from something that grows from the ground, ein mesachin boy, then it's not kosher for schach. It means even animal hides that are not yet considered utensils, so they cannot become tomei, nonetheless it's not called gedulei min ha'aretz, and therefore it will not be kosher schach. V'chol davar she'einem mekabel tumah, anything that could not become tomei, v'gidulei min ha'aretz, and originally it's something that grew from the ground, mesachin boy, that's the ideal and only kosher schach. Says the Gemara, Yosef Rav Yosef kamed Rav Huna. Rav Yosef was sitting before Rav Huna. V'Yosef ka'omar, and Rav Yosef said as follows: Oy shekitzitzon kshera. This that it says in the Mishnah, that if you put schach on the sukkah that was still attached to the ground, and if you then cut it down, it's kosher. Rav Yosef says that Rav said tzarich lenanea. It's not good enough just to cut it down, because we'll soon see why. Because there's a halacha of tasev eloi min ha'osui. Sukkah has to be made kosher. It cannot become kosher. That means when you put the schach there, when you do something with the schach, then it's got to be kosher. Over here, when you actually put the schach on, then it was not kosher because it was still attached to the ground, and just severing it from the ground is not considered doing something to the sukkah. Therefore, Rav maintained that if you're not menanea, if you don't move the schach after it's been detached from the ground, then it's posel. If, however, you still shake around the schach and you make sure to move every piece of schach that was initially attached and now has been detached, you move it around, then it's kosher, because the movement itself is considered as a gemar, as an ending, as a finality of the putting the schach there, and therefore it's not considered tasev eloi min ha'osui, and it's kosher. Amar Rav Huna. Rav Huna now turned to Rav Yosef. Rav Yosef was sitting in front of Rav Huna and said this in the name of Rav. Rav Huna turned to Rav Yosef and said, Ha Shmuel Amra. What you said in the name of Rav, Shmuel said it. Rav Yosef turned his face away, in, so to speak, in dismay against Rav Huna. Rav Yosef commented to Rav Huna and said, all I did was said this in the name of Rav, and you're telling me Shmuel said it. I didn't say Shmuel didn't say it. Amra Rav, Amra Shmuel. It could be Rav said it and Shmuel said it. What are you coming to add? What are you coming to argue with me? Like, did I say something wrong? If I said something wrong, then I can understand that you're commenting. But what did I say different to you? Rav Huna says you misunderstood me. What I meant to say was the Shmuel Omra. It was only Shmuel who holds of what you said in the name of Rav, that you have to move that schach that was initially schach posel and is now schach kosher. You have to move it in order to be able to use the sukkah. V'lo Rav, but Rav disagrees with what you said. What you said in the name of Rav, Rav said the opposite. The Rav achshurei machshir. Rav holds that just virtue of cutting this branch away from its source, from the ground, that in itself is enough, and is considered, the cutting itself is considered as the end of the putting of the schach, and therefore it's kosher. Kihadar of Amram Chasida, similar to what we saw in the name of Amram Chasida. And we know there's a halacha that sukkah has to be made. It says Chaga sukkah is ta'aseh. You have to make a sukkah, and then it also says, Gedilim ta'aseh, you have to make tzitzis. How do you make tzitzis? By knotting strings onto the corners of a four-cornered garment. So we assume them to be the same. What's going to be if you knotted up the strings when it was posel? We'll soon see what that means. And then you made it kosher by cutting it. Is that okay or not? It would seem to be a machlekes Rav and Shmuel, as we just saw now. What did Rav Amram Chasida say? That Rav Amram Chasida was Rama Tchilta. He put the tcheles, which is one of the threads of the tzitzis, leparzuma de anshe beisa, onto the cloak of the women of his household, his wife's cloak, because Rav Amram Chasida held that the night is also a time for wearing tzitzis, and therefore tzitzis is a mitzvah sasei she'ein azman groma. It's not limited by time, and therefore women are also chayiv. And at one point he put the strings onto the garment. Then instead of putting 4 strings doubled over through the hole, he had one long string that was just like going backwards and forwards, and he pulled them through the hole at the corner of the garment, but it was still a single thread. It was not 4 separate threads. And then he'd knotted it all up, and now he came to ask the question, can I just cut the edges, making it 4 strings or not? So also the Kamedu Rav Chia bar Ashi came before Rav Chia bar Ashi, Omar Le, and said to him, and Rav Chia bar Ashi said, Hocha Omar Rav, that Rav said, Mafsikon, just cut them, Ven ksherim, and it's kosher. Alma we see, Psikoson, just cutting the threads, Zuhi Asiyoson, that's considered making the tzitzis. Hochanami, so too regarding sukkah, will assume, Ktzisason, Zuhi Asiyoson, that cutting the attached schach from the ground, that's called making the sukkah, making the schach, and it's kosher. So you see clearly, not like Rav Yosef said in the name of Rav, you see clearly that Rav holds that cutting is considered an asiyah, is considered an act of doing the sukkah, and therefore there's no issue of ta'aseh v'lo min ha'asui, and therefore you do not need to be mena'anea. And who says you need to be mena'anea? You need to move around the apostle schach in order for it to be kosher, is Shmuel. Asks the Gemara of a Sovar Shmuel, Lo yomrin on psikoson zu yasiyason, based on what we said before, that according to Shmuel, you need to be menanea, you need to move the schach, which means virtue of cutting them doesn't suffice. If so, when it comes to the tzitzis, if you just cut the edge of the threads, now making it after you've done the tzitzis, after you've knotted the tzitzis, you're now making it kosher, it should be possible according to Shmuel. V'hatani Shmuel mishum Reb Chia. Did Shmuel not teach in the name of Reb Chia, hitil lishnei kronos b'vas achas, if you thread it through 2 corners at once, v'achar kach posak, and only after you've knotted them up, you posak, you separated, you cut the strings in the middle. Posak roshei chutim shalehem, you cut to the edges of the strings, now separating them. Ksherin, it's kosher, even though in the state when it's all joined, it's not, you cannot, it's possible. Nonetheless, Shmuel said, just cut it and it's kosher. So you see that according to Shmuel, it's enough if you cut. My love, can we not assume that this incident where Shmuel said in the name of Rabbi Chia that cutting is enough is shekosher v'achar kach poisek, that he first tied the tzitzis together, knotted them all up, and then cut it, and then it would be a question against what we said in the name of Shmuel here, that once you've placed the schach, cutting it is not enough. Says the Gemara, no. We're talking about where he's true that he threaded the strings through the hole. He didn't yet knot them. Making tzitzis means knotting the tzitzis. As long as you cut it before you knot the tzitzis, it's okay. Because then when you made the tzitzis, when you knotted them, it was kosher. And therefore it's not comparable to putting schach that was mechuber lekarka onto the sukkah and then cutting it. Poisek v'achar kach kosher, ma'ile memra. If so, if it's talking about that he cut the strings and then he knotted them, what's the chiddush? We take that for granted. What are you trying to teach us? If Shmuel would have taught in the name of Rabbi Chia that even if you cut it after you've knotted them, it's kosher, I can understand. He's telling us an element of chiddush, that there's no taseh v'lo min ha'osoi. But Shmuel doesn't hold that way. He says, you have to cut it before you knot it. So what's the chiddush? Says the Gemara, I'll tell you the chiddush. Ma'odetei, I may have thought that be'inon knaf b'shas psil, because the pasuk mentions konof psil techeles. Whilst you're actually threading the strings through the corners, it already has to be knaf. It has to be a separate corner. It cannot be two corners with the strings of the two corners attached to each other. Veleka, in this case, where you threaded the two corners, the strings were attached to each other. I may have thought it's possible. Kumash malon. That's what Shmuel is coming to tell us, that there's no problem. The actual threading of the strings through the corners, that doesn't need to be that it's done in a state where it's just one corner at a time, that's later going to be a condition for kashrus. No, as long as you cut the strings and separate the corners before you knot them, it's kosher. Kumash malon, that's what Shmuel is coming to teach us. Asks the Gemara Meisvei, Tol on v'lo posak roshei chutim shalohem. We learned in a brisa that if you hang the tzitzis onto the corners of a four-cornered garment, v'lo posak roshei chutim shalohem is one long thread that's just been intertwined, but it's not four separate threads. Psulin, it's pasul. What does that mean? My love, can we not assume psulim la'olam, that it's always going to be pasul, even if you cut them after you knotted them? So, and that would be a question on Rav. Rav said before, cutting them even after you knot them is okay. Shmuel is the one that says you have to cut them before you knot them. So over here it says pasul, which means according to Shmuel, once you've knotted them, it's too late. For eternity, they're pasul. So it's a proof from the brisa to Shmuel. And it's a question against Rav. Utiyuf to the Rav. Answers the Gemara, Rav, Mar psulim, psulim at yifsuku. What Rav says, what the brisa means is that they remain pasul until you cut them. Once you cut them, they're no longer pasul. Shmuel Omar, psulim lo'ilam. However, as we saw before, Shmuel holds that after you've knotted the tzitzis, that's it. Even if you cut them afterwards, it's pasul. Levi psulim lo'ilam. Levi also says the same. V'chenomar of Masna Omar Shmuel. Rav Masna also said in the name of Shmuel, as we saw before from Shmuel, that psulim lo'ilam, they stay pasul. You cannot cut them after you've knotted them. Iked Omra, another version, Omer of Masna, because now we just saw in the name of Rav Masna that Shmuel says, Psulim la'olam, you cannot cut the strings and separate them after they've been knotted. Another version, Omer of Masna, B'didiya v'uvda, there was an incident with me. V'asoi l'kamei mar Shmuel, and I came before Shmuel. V'omer li, and he told me, Psulim la'olam, he says, you've already knotted them up, and now you remember that you haven't cut the strings and separated them, it's going to be pasul forever. It doesn't help to sever the strings now. Continues the Gemara, another question against Rav. Meisvei, Tol on v'achar kach posak roshei chutin. If you first put the strings in through the garment, of the four-cornered garment, and you knotted them up, and only afterwards, posak, you severed roshei chutim, the ends of the string, that means when you threaded them through, it was just one long string. Roshei chutim shalem, psulim, it's pasul. And this seems to be a question according to Rav. Rav says, why is it pasul? Just cut them now. They're pasul till you cut them. Just cut them. Cut the edges of the strings, it's kosher. Another question, V'oid, Tanya Gabas Sukkah. We learned by sukkah, the pasuk says, Chag sukkah is ta'aseh lecha. You have to make a sukkah. What do we learn from there? A famous halacha, ta'aseh v'lo min ha'osui, that when the sukkah is kosher, it has to be made in its state of kashrus. It cannot become min ha'osui. It cannot happen on its own. It has to be made kosher. It cannot happen. You can't do something on the side and then automatically the consequence will be that the original sukkah now becomes kosher. That's not called making a sukkah, and therefore it will be possible. What do we learn from there? Mikan omru, says the Brisa, we learn from there that hidlo aleos hagefen mesadlas v'sakisum, as we saw in our Mishnah, if you were to put on top of the sukkah the branches of a grapevine, of squash, of ivy, v'sikech al gabon, and you put schach on top of them, psula, it's possible. When is it possible? Heichadomi, when is it possible? Im leime b'shalei katzutzon, are you going to say it's possible when you didn't sever them from their roots? My irium mishum ta'aseh v'lo min ha'osui. Then why are you learning that from ta'aseh v'lo min ha'osui? Typically, the mechubarim ninu. Say that the reason it's possible is because it's mechubar. Mechubar lekarka is a psul in and of its own right. I don't need ta'aseh v'lo min ha'osui. Elo b'shekatzutzon. It must be the Brisa is talking about that after I put this schach onto the sukkah, I cut away the branches. It's no longer attached to the ground. Uktani psula, and the Brisa says it's possible because ta'aseh v'lo min ha'osui. When you made the sukkah, when you put the schach on top of the sukkah, it was possible. Now all you did was cut away the branch from its source. That's called osui. Now the sukkah just on its own became kosher. That's not kosher. So what do we see from this Brisa? So you learn from this Brisa, it's almost explicit, ta'aseh v'lo min ha'osui says that once you cut it, it doesn't help. It's because it became kosher, you didn't make it kosher. And so you see clearly that cutting it is not called making it. Utiyuvta de Rav. And it's a refutation against Rav, who says that if you cut it after you put the schach there, it's kosher. So Rav answered regarding the second question, that the Brisa that says that there's an issue of ta'aseh v'lo min ha'osui, even when you've cut it, is deshalfinu shlufei. That's only when you pulled away this branch from its roots. And you cannot tell that you actually cut it. You can't see the cut. It was just pulled away. If, however, you clearly cut the branch, that's a good enough and a noticeable enough act that it's called ta'aseh, it's called making the sukkah, and Rav says it's kosher. Mikol mokim. What about the first question that we asked against Rav from Tzitzis? We saw there, Tolon v'achar posak, that it seems in that Brisa that if you cut the strings after you knotted them, the Brisa says psulim. Kashya Rav. That's still a question against Rav. According to Rav, just cut them. Answers the Gemara, Kashya. Indeed, it's a question, and it remains a question. Continues the Gemara, Lema katanoi. Can we assume, as we're about to see, that this concept is cutting something down, considered an act of doing, that it's actually a machlokas tanoim? Till now it seemed it was a machlokas ameroim between Rav and Shmuel. We're going to see that it seems to be a machlokas tanoim. Because we saw there's a Mishnah we're going to learn later on, in Daf Lamed Beis, that regarding the hadassim, the three hadassim that we tie together with the lulav, if there are grapes, anovim, that are together with the leaves, that doesn't look nice, and it's possible. If, however, you cut down the grapes, these berries or whatever they're called, then it's kosher. The question is, what happens if you tied the lulav and the hadassim together, and then on Yom Tov, you've now realized that these hadassim, there's too many anovim on the hadassim. What are you supposed to do? So the halacha is you're not allowed to, on Yom Tov, you're not allowed to pull them off, because it's called fixing the hadassim on Yom Tov. And you're not allowed to fix anything on Shabbos or Yom Tov. What happens if this person did take away these anovim on Yom Tov? So there's a Brisa that discusses that. So this person who went against what the Chachomim said, that you're not allowed to pick these anovim off on Yom Tov, and he did, and Velikton, and he pulled off these grapes on Yom Tov, Posel Divi Reb Shimon Bar Yochai Tzadok says that it is posel. The Chachamim say, you shouldn't have done it. You did it, it's kosher. Sovrua. So the Chachamim and the Beis HaMedrash assumed that the Kule Alma Lulav Tzorich Eged. Everybody agrees that a lulav has to be tied with the hadassim and the arovos. And then we assume that when were they tied? You cannot make a knot on Yom Tov. It was tied before Yom Tov. V'yalfinon lulav misukah. We learn lulav from sukkah. D'chsiv gaba sukkah ta'aseh v'lo min osui. In the same way as that it says by sukkah, ta'aseh, you have to make a sukkah. And we've learned from there, ta'aseh v'lo min osui, you have to make it, and not that it happened on its own. And so too, lulav, we also say the same, that it's got to be ta'aseh v'lo min ha'osui. And then if so, ma'elav b'hal k'mifligi. So this is what we're arguing about. Manda Omar Mach, the Manda Machshir, the one according to the Chachomim who say that one, if you pick off these grapes, these berries from the Hadassim on Yom Tov, it's kosher. Sovar Omrin on Gabasuka, Ktitzason, Zuyasayason. They say that over here, that it's true that when I tied the lulav, that's the asiyah, the doing of the lulav, is the tying it. So it's true that when I tied it, then it was possible because there were too many anovim. But pulling off the anovim is similar to severing the schach. And ktitzason zuyasiyason, that in itself is considered an act of doing, and therefore it's kosher. So we assume that this opinion will hold. The same with the schach. Just cut it down, like Rav said, and that's enough. It's as ktitzason, cutting it is called doing it. V'gabelulav nami omrino likitosom zuyasiyason, and lulav also, removing these berries, these grapes, is considered doing, making it. Uman de Posel, however, according to Shimon Bar Yochai, who says that it's Posel, Sava, he says, Lo yomrin on gabesuka ktitzason zuyasiyason. He says, like we saw from Shmuel before, that you don't say that cutting is called doing. And therefore, the Gabelulav Nami, so the same will be by Lulav. Lo yomrino likitoson zuyasiyason. So he will not hold that picking these grapes is considered doing it, making it kosher. It's considered that it became kosher on its own. Because when you tied it, it was posel. Because of all these anovim. You've now removed the anovim, and now suddenly it's kosher. That's called osui, it's not called taseh. And therefore it's posel. So that's what the Gemara is saying. Can we assume the machlokas of Shimon Bar Yochai and the Chachomim is actually that machlokas, Rav and Shmuel, and we're not so comfortable having a machlokas amiroim that's actually a machlokas tanoim? Says the Gemara, loy. No. The Kuli Alma, it could be everybody agrees, lo yomrin on gabesuka ktitzason zuyasiyason. Even if everybody were to follow what Shmuel said before, that means both of these Tanoim could be following Shmuel. That by sukkah, ktitzason is not asiyason. And we say that cutting is not called doing. However, by sukkah, by lulav, is different. V'hacha b'meilef lulav misukah kamifligi. The whole discussion is, can we learn, or do we learn lulav from sukkah? Man de machshir, according to the Chachomim, who say that it's kosher, if you pull off these anovim from the hadassim, they say lo yalfinon lulav misukah. We don't learn lulav from sukkah. It's true that by sukkah there's a halacha of ta'aseh v'lo min ha'osui. By lulav there's no din of ta'aseh v'lo min ha'osui. You don't have to do it. It's enough if it just happens. So if when you did it, when you did the eged, indeed it was possible, and later it just became kosher because you pulled off those anovim, it's okay, it's kosher. Uman de Posel, however, the opinion that says that it's Posel, Reb Shimon Bar Yochai, he's going to say, Sava yolfinon lulav misukah, he's going to learn from a binyanav lulav from sukkah, and the same way as sukkah there's ta'aseh v'lo min ha'osui, so too lulav is ta'aseh v'lo min ha'osui, and therefore it's Posel. V'iboy same it could be, Isvirelon de lulav tzorich eged. It could be that if you say that indeed lulav needs to be tied, which means there is a concept of asiyah, of doing, in preparation of the lulav, then everyone will agree, lulav misukah. We do learn that lulav from sukkah, and there is an issue of ta'aseh v'lo min ha'osui. And therefore pulling off the berries, it will be possible according to everybody. And what we're arguing about here, that means they're not arguing whether we say ta'aseh v'lo min ha'osui. They're arguing whether is there a concept of asiyah at all. Before we said that everybody agrees there's asiyah. It's called the igud, the tying of the three minim, the lulav, the Hadassim and the Aravas. The question is that now that you have to do something, is there a problem of Tasa v'lo min ha'asui? Now we're saying no. Everybody would say there is. The question is there any requirement of Tasa at all? Marasova tzorich eged, the opinion that says that it's possible, that holds according to Reb Shimon bar Yitzchok, who says it's possible, he says that there's an asiyah. Lulav tzorich eged. Or Marasova, the Chachomim who say it's kosher, they say ain't tzorich eged. They say you don't need to tie them at all. So there's no concept of asiyah. If there's no concept of asiyah, there's no concept of Tasa v'lo min ha'asui. Continues the Gemara, but plukta dehani tanoi, this machleikus that we just suggested now, according to one explanation, that they're arguing, the Chachomim and Reb Shimon bar Yitzchok are arguing whether there's a requirement to tie the lulav with the Hadassim and Aravas or not, is a machleikus tanoim. The Tani we learned in the Braisa, lulav bein ogud bein she'ene ogud kosher. The Tana Kama say you can shake lulav irrespective of whether it's tied with the Hadassim and the Aravas or not. Rabbi Yehuda says, ogud, if it's the lulav is tied with Hadassim and Aravas, kosher, then it's kosher. She'ene ogud, if it's not tied with Hadassim and Aravas, posel, then it's posel. So you see there is such a machleikas tanoim, so that might be the machleikas tanoim between the Chachomim and Reb Shimon bar Yitzchok. Asks the Gemara, my Talmud Rabbi Yehuda, what would be the source for Rabbi Yehuda who says that lulav tzorich eged, you have to tie the lulav with Hadassim and Aravas? So the Gemara says, Yalif lekicha, it's a gzera shava, we learn me'agudas ezov, from the grass that's being tied, as we saw in the Psukim. The Pasuk says when they went out of Mitzrayim, then they would dip the ezov, this grass, this hyssop grass, into the blood and put it onto the doorposts of their homes. Ulekachtem agudas ezov, they will take a bundle of this grass, utvaltem badom, and dip it into the blood, asher basaf, v'igatem el hamashkeif el shnei hamezuzos min adom asher basof, v'atem lo yiseitzu ish mipesach beisoi ad boike. There it says explicitly agudas ezov, it was a bundle of these grasses, of this hyssop grass, the ezov. So in the same way as it says there, ulekachtem, and it also says by taking the lulav, Uchsiv hacha ulekachtem lochem bayom rishoin priet hador kapis tmorim vanafitz avos arvinachal usmachtem lifnei Hashem lekechem shivas yomim. Mal'alon, in the same way as by the taking the grass for the blood of by the korban pesach in Mitzrayim, ba'aguda, it was an agudas ezov, it was a bundle. Afkan, so too by lulav ulekachtem is nami ba'aguda, is also with a bundle. You have to bundle the lulav together with Hadassim and the Aravas. The Rabbanon who say that lulav is kosher even if it's not bundled together, lekicha milekicha lo yalfinon, they don't hold of this gzera shava. You don't learn from the blood of Mitzrayim to the Arba Minim. Continues the Gemara. Kaman oz lehoda Tanya, who's the following brisa following? Lulav mitzvah le'ogdoi. There's a mitzvah, it's preferable that indeed you should tie them. Ve'im lo yogdoi kosher. But if you didn't tie them, it's still kosher. Ik Rabbi Yehuda, kile ogda mai kosher. If it would be following Rabbi Yehuda says that it's not just preferable to be tied, it's essential that it should be tied, and if it's not tied, it's not kosher. I Rabbanon, according to Rabbanon, and my mitzvah, why is it preferable to tie them? They said, the Chachomim said, bein ogud, bein she'ene ogud kosher. It's kosher irrespective of whether it was tied. So what's the mitzvah to tie it? Says the Gemara, lo'ilam Rabbanon. This price is following the Rabbanon who say that you should tie it. It's not essential. Lo'ilam Rabbanon hi. And that's why if you didn't do it, it's still kosher. Where would this mitzvah come from? Or mishum shenemar, it's not coming from agudas ezov. It's coming from a pasuk shenemar ze'akeli v'anveyu. You have to beautify a mitzvah. This is Hashem's mitzvahs. You have to do them with a maximum beauty. Hisno elefon of the mitzvahs. You should beautify the mitzvahs before Hashem. And when taking a lulav, when bundled together with Hadassim and the Aravas, that's the most beautiful way of taking the lulav. And therefore the Chachomim say, mitzvah, you should do this mitzvah and tie the lulav with the Hadassim and the Aravas. Continues the Gemara. We saw in the Mishnah, till now we're discussing mechuber lekarka. But we saw there's another two conditions, besides the fact that the schach mustn't be attached to the ground whilst being schach. There's another two conditions for kosher schach. Number one, it has to be something which is not susceptible to become tomei. Number two, it has to be something that originally was something that grew from the ground. Asks the Gemara, Minoan Amili, what would be the source for these two conditions? Where do we see by sukkah that we have the conditions, we have such a halacha? Omer Shlokish suggests, Omakra, from the following pasuk. The pasuk says in Parshas Bereishis, V'eid, which is a cloud or some mist, Yalem in the Oretz, rose up from the ground, from the earth, V'hishka, and it poured rain, Al Kol Pnei Adama, onto the surface of the land. So we see there that a cloud was Yalem in the Oretz, went up from the ground. Ma'eid, in the same way as this cloud, Dava she'enim mekabel tumah. The cloud itself is not mekabel tumah. What's mekabel tumah? Food, utensils, foods, drinks, people. Clouds are not mekabel tumah. V'gidulei min ha'aretz, and this cloud is considered that it grew from the ground, because it says v'eid yalem min ha'aretz, af sukkah, so too sukkah, which the whole concept of sukkahs is a concept of clouds, because we see in the psukim we have to remember that Hashem, when He took us out of Mitzrayim, He took us out surrounded by clouds. So it must be davar she'ein mekabel tumah v'gidulei min ha'aretz, that so too whatever makes the sukkah kosher, the schach, has to be something which comes from the ground and is not able to become tomei. Says the Gemara, that's all according to the opinion who says that when Hashem took us out of Mitzrayim, He took us out with in sukkahs, and the sukkahs that He took us out with is referring to the sukkahs of the clouds, that we were in a hut, so to speak, encircled by the clouds. According to the opinion that says that when Hashem took us out of Mitzrayim, there were actual huts that protected us from the sun, from the heat. Those huts, who told us that those huts were made with something that was not mekabel tumah? Maybe those huts were covered with clothes, with utensils, with hides of animals, which are not gidulim min hakarka. They don't grow from the ground. Who told you? The Tanya, we actually saw in a brisa these two opinions, that the pasuk says, "Leman yedu deiroseichem ki basukah yishavti es bnei Yisrael, b'hoitzi oisam meretz v'tzayim ani Hashem elokeichem." We sit in the sukkah in order to remember that Hashem took us out with sukkahs, and we see there that the first opinion says, "Anani kavatayu." These sukkahs, they were the clouds of Hashem. Rabbi Eliezer, but that's only the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Akiva argues and says, Sukkos mamash asulahem. Hashem made them actual sukkos. So Hanich Rabbi Eliezer, contra Rabbi Eliezer, who says that our sukkahs represent the clouds of then we can understand that we learn from there that the sukkah has to be something which comes from the ground and cannot become tomei. Elul Rabbi Akiva, contra Rabbi Akiva, who says that sukkah is real sukkah, is not clouds. Ma'ikele meimar, what would be your source that schach has to be something which is gedulim min haaretz and eino mekabel tumah? Answers the Gemara, Ki also of Dimi Omer Rabbi Yochanan brought another source, not v'eid yalem min haaretz that we saw before, for that Rish Lakish says. Rish Lakish found another source. Omer Kro, it says in the pasuk, Chag HaSukkos ta'aseh lecha. Do for yourself the Yom Tov of Sukkos. Makish Sukkah lechagiga. We already saw this concept on Daf Tesomid Aleph. Chag HaSukkos. We compare the concept of Chag, which is the Korban Chagiga, to the concept of Sukkos. Ma Chagiga, in the same way as the Korban Chagiga, at least whilst it's alive, is a Dover she'eino mekabel tumah. It's not something that can become tomei. Animals can't become tomei. V'gidulei min ha'aretz, and they they get their nourishment from eating off the ground. Af sukkah, so to sukkah, is dover because chag hasukkahs. Sukkahs is talking about the schach of the sukkah, is dover she'eino mekabel tumah. It's similar to the animal chagiga that cannot become tomei. V'gidulei min ha'aretz, it's similar to the animal chagiga that it nourishes from the ground, which means it's something that only something that grew from the ground is kosher for schach. Asks the Gemara, against what Rabbi Yochanan said, if you're learning that the schach of the sukkah has to be similar to chagiga, maybe we learn from there any balei chaim. And there's a big discussion in the Achronim what the Gemara means to ask here. Does the Gemara mean to ask that only balei chaim? Maybe you learn from chagiga that you have to use schach only animals, and not things that actually grew from the ground. Or some Achreinim say that Balei Chaim means anything of Balei Chaim, even the hides, the skins of Balei Chaim would also be kosher, and we know that not to be true. Af sukkah nami balichaim. If that's what the Gemara is asking, that according to Rabbi Yochanan, maybe we would learn from Chag HaSukkah is that balichaim have to be used or can be used for schach. Ki also Rav Omer Rabbi Yochanan. So this is another source, a third source for the klal, for the rule mentioned in the Mishnah. Again, in the name of Rabbi Yochanan. Before it was of Dimi Omer Rabbi Yochanan. Now it's Ravin Omer Rabbi Yochanan. They both of Dimi and Rovin, they were in Eretz Yisrael, which is where Rabbi Yochanan lived. They came to Bovel. That's Ki also when they came. So when Rovin came, he said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan that we learn out from a third source, from a pasuk Omar Kro. It says in the pasuk, Chag HaSukkah is taseh lecho shivas yomim. You should make yourself the yontiv of Sukkot for 7 days. Ba'osbecha, with your gathering, when you gather, migarnecha, from the threshing floor, u'miikvecha, and from the wine vat. What do we learn from there? Bipsoiles, it's what the leftovers of the Geiren V'Yekev, of the threshing floor and the wine vat, what's left over? The psoiles, the leftover, the chaff and the stalks, and those things, they're not makabel tumah, because they can't be used for anything, they're not food in any way, and they grew from the ground. So you see from there that the Chag HaSukkah Taseh L'chol Shivas Yomim has to be from psoiles, Geiren V'Yekev, Hakosav Medaber. Asks the Gemara that if you learn it from Ba'osbecha, Migarnecha, Mi'ikvecha, who says it's from the psoiles? Who says it's from what's left over, from what's gathered after you've made the wine and after you've threshed the produce, the grains, and what's left? That's the psoiles. Maybe Ve'ema, Geiren Atzmoi, V'Yekev Atzmoi. Maybe what it means is that you can actually use the straw itself, which is makabel tumah, or the grapes themselves, which is makabel tumah. Maybe you can use those items that were put into the threshing floor and into the wine vat. Who told you it's what's left after you've finished threshing it and after you've finished making the wine? And if so, it's makabel tumah, it's oichlin, it's oichlin, it's food. Omer Zera says, because yekev ksiv, it speaks explicitly about the wine vat, Yekev ksiv kan, and the Yekev itself, what's in the Yekev? In the Yekev itself, in the wine vat, you've got wine. You can't make schach with wine. So it's not talking about the food part of the Yekev, it's what's left over after you've made the food. What's left over after you've made the food is not makabel tumah, it grew from the ground. That's the source to the rules in the Mishnah. It says the Gemara, Omer B'Zera, Yekev ksiv kan v'yefshel esakich b'y. Maskif Rav Yirmiyah. Rav Yirmiyah asked a question, how can you, Rovin, in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, say that the source that schach kosher has to be something that grew from the ground and is not makabel tumah is from this pasuk? Maybe this pasuk is telling us yayin korush, that you can use schach. What was your question? That it's migarnecha mikvecha. Maybe it's not what's left over after you make the wine and after you thrash the grains. Maybe it's the grains itself. So we said, okay, the grains, maybe you could put the stalks on the schach, but what's with the wine? With the wine, you can't. The wine in the wine vat, you can't use that for schach. So Rav Yirmiyah says, no. I can tell you can use wine, not in its liquid form, in its solid form. Ve'eme yayin korush, maybe the pasuk means the congealed wine, haba mishnir, that comes from a place of snir. Shehu doime legule dveila, it's similar to round cakes of pressed figs. And maybe you can use schach, so you'll know that it has to be something that grew from the ground, but it's makabel tumah. Who told you that something that's makabel tumah is not kosher for schach? Omer Abzera says, "Ha milsa have a beyadon." We always knew this pasuk of Ba'osbecha Migarnecha Miukvecha to be the source for this halacha, that schach has to be from something that grew from the ground and is not makabel tumah. V'aser Rabbi Yirmiyah came v'shad abonarga, and he threw an axe at it. We always knew this to be true, and he asked us a good question when he said maybe the pasuk is talking about the congealed wine. Maybe indeed you can use schach of something which is makabel tumah. Says Rav Ashi Omar, that from this pasuk you can actually see it's not talking about the food part of the wine vat, it's talking about what's left after you've made the wine. Because it says, Mi garnecha v'lo geiren atzmoi, mi ikvecha v'lo yekev atzmoi. It's not because that mi ikvecha and you can't use wine for schach, it must mean what's left over. No, it's from the word mi. That means it's after you've taken away the wine, what's left? What's left is the pseiles. And the pseiles, what's left over, is never mekabel tumah. Continues the Gemara, Rav Chisda Amar Mehacha, the fourth and final source for the rules in our Mishnah is from here. The Pasuk says, in Nehemiah, Rashi calls it Me'ezra, but Ezra and Nehemiah is the same. Rabbi Akiva Eiger discusses that here. What does it say in the Pasuk? V'asher yashmi'u v'yaviru koil b'chol oreim u'b'Yerushalayim leimir. Tzu'u hahar, go out to the mountain, v'haviu, and bring alei zayis, the leaves of the olive trees, v'alei eitz shemen, and the leaves of the tree from where we produce the oil, v'alei hadas, and the leaves of the hadassim, v'alei tmorim, and the leaves of the date trees, v'alei eitz avos, and the leaves of the tree of the eitz avos, which is also hadassim. So what do we see from here? That all the things that were mentioned, because the pasuk brings, that carries on, la'asais sukkah is kakosov, in order to, with these things, to be able to use it for schach. And all the things mentioned here grew from the ground and are not mekabel tumah. So from this pasuk, says of Chisda, you see the rules in our Mishnah, kosher schach is only something that grew from the ground and is not mekabel tumah. And by the way, that we've mentioned this pasuk, the Gemara asks, why does it say also ale hadas, the leaves of a hadas tree, and also ale eitz avos? Eitz avos is hadassim. When we look in the pasuk of the Arba Minim on Sukkot, it says eitz avos, which is referring to the hadassim. It seems to be a double term. Hainu hadas, hainu eitz avos. Amar of Chisda says no, bring them both. Why? Because on Sukkot we need them both. But there's a difference between hadas and eitz avos. Eitz avos is when they are very beautifully arranged, that the leaves, that from every point there's 3 leaves protruding, and that's kosher hadassim for arba minim. Regular hadas is not a kosher hadas, it's a hadassim tree, but not a kosher hadas. You can't use this stalk in your lulav because it's not meshulash, it's not got 3 leaves from every point. So the pasuk is saying, bring them both. Hadas shlita, the uneven hadas, lesukkah, that you'll use for the schach. Ve'etz avos, and the nicely arranged and evenly arranged hadassim, that's called eitz avos. Lulav, you're going to use that for the lulav, not for the schach. And in Mirz Hashem, in the next shiur, we're going to continue the next Mishnah.